Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keith Warren from the Foodservice Equipment Association. Also from our side, we've got Andy Threlfall, our Technical and Policy Director, Jocelyn Scheuer, our Events and Membership Manager, and in the background, Adam Lawrence, our Marketing Manager. And the purpose of today is to bring you all up to speed with a safe, easy and cost-effective way of starting to look at or reporting and measuring your carbon. And this is against a backdrop of feedback we've had from members where end user operators are asking equipment supply companies for their carbon reports. And certainly from the work that Andy does with government, we know that particularly for the public sector, it's very high on the radar to ensure that operators in the public sector are starting to measure and report their carbon. So as a result, we become, as the equipment supply chain, the scope 3 emissions for the operator. And for that reason, just over a year ago, the FEA collaborated with CAFA, which is Climate Action for Associations, and they're represented on the call today by the Chief Exec Alison Heppenstall, by Lindsay Roberts, and also by Mihak, who are going to run through the mainstay of the presentation. But really what I want to emphasize is that we did a lot of work looking at other suppliers of this service, and this is certainly the most cost effective to give exactly the same, and in fact, in some cases, an enhanced level of measurement and reporting. And as every business manager, we've got to get into this carbon management and reporting issue. If we don't, it's just going to result in a loss of business. If we do, it's going to grow business, because we can guarantee that in 10 years' time, any business that isn't reporting its carbon will not be on the procurement schedules for many operators, and that's whether they're in the public or the private sector. And the cost of entry, rather than you waiting all to the end, if you're a small business under 10 employees, it's only going to be just under £1,000 a year to get on this journey. So what we've done is negotiated with Alison to make the cost of monitoring and reporting your carbon as economic as possible. Part of what we try to do as the FEA to reduce your cost by amortizing the cost against a larger number of businesses. And also what it means is that as the FEA, we can start promoting through our website those of you as businesses who are signed up to carbon management and reduction programs, so that it starts to then become a buying point for the operator channel and also for dealers. And the dealers are going to be under pressure to make sure the equipment that's being specified has a carbon reporting chain behind it. So that is where I'll leave it. Alison, if I may, I'll hand over to you to take us through the rest of the presentation. Thank you, Alison.
Thanks, Keith. That was a great setup for our presentation today. Really appreciate it, and appreciate the chance to speak to you all again. My name, if you missed it, is Ali Heppenstall. I'm the Executive Director of Climate Action for Associations. I'm joined today by a few members of our team. We have Mehek, who is our Senior Impact Lead, and Crispin and Lindsay, who are Net Zero team, ready to run through the presentation. We're going to do it collaboratively. If you have any questions, if they're massively burning, please feel free to put them in the chat and we can address them as we're running through. Otherwise, we'll have a Q&A at the end. But as I said, we'd like to make this as as collaborative as possible. So please put any questions that you have in the chat. And if we can't get to them today, then we'll definitely reply to you individually by follow-up email. You can also have a copy of these slides as well after, and I know that Jocelyn is recording today's session as well if you need to watch it all over again. So just a quick intro from me about Climate Action for Associations. So we were established in early 2021. We set up CAFA as a not-for-profit collective. Our view is that we wanted to harness the influence and power that membership organisations have, both on the trade association side and on the individual professional body side, to accelerate climate action. Our belief is that membership organisations have the opportunity to take much more of a leadership stance, and also to influence and to challenge and to support the members that they represent. So we're really excited that the FEA was one of our first organisations that joined CAFA in 2021. We're obviously gone on to form a really strong relationship where FEA is now on its own carbon reduction journey. Its first report is about to be released and brainstormed with an action plan with the FEA, and Lindsay and Crispin have been working really hard on that. And we've designed the climate action for business, or climate action for organisations proposition, specifically to help our members, particularly on the trade association side, to accelerate their own climate action journey and start to reduce their carbon. Basically, CAFA provides the information, guidance and learning that membership organisations and their members need to accelerate climate action and to reduce their carbon footprint. And we are an official UN-backed Race to Zero accelerator, where we're focused on driving systems and industry change. The last thing I'll do is I will plug the fact that we are a huge part of London Climate Action Week this year, as well as New York Climate Week, and hope to be involved physically in COP28 later this year as well. I will hand over to my colleague next to frame exactly what we're doing in terms of the net zero business proposition and the rollout of the service for the FEA. Thanks, Crispin.
Thanks, Ali, and hi, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Crispin and run the carbon net zero team at CAFA. I'm going to run through the background behind why we're here and having this conversation, and what carbon emissions really mean. Forgive me if you know some of this already, but I think it's useful to start at the beginning and look at the whole journey all the way through to some of the more complicated scope 3 elements. So it comes as no surprise that we're in a climate emergency. We've been burning or creating greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution, and we're now at a position where globally we need to act. We're seeing the results of the climate change with the severe weather conditions that are seen globally, and the UK, as well as many governments, have committed to becoming net zero by 2050 and halving emissions by 2030. Now, that commitment, certainly in the UK, has led to legislative change. We're seeing net zero and carbon legislation follow many other legislations that have come in, such as data protection, where it starts at the sort of the big projects, the big government projects, and then flow down throughout the entire supply chain into all the smaller ones, and are then written into law. So if you're not being asked for carbon figures yet, I have absolutely no doubt that it will come, and it will come from all sorts of different directions. From, you know, if you're writing tenders for projects, there'll be carbon questions in there. Your customers, as Keith alluded to earlier, will start to be asking for your carbon footprints and your carbon reduction strategies, as well as those of your products. Even employees entering the workplace are looking to work with companies that have environmentally conscious policies. So there's a lot of reason to start this journey if you haven't already. So greenhouse gases are made up of a number of different gases. The greenhouse gas protocols and a globally recognized standard is to refer to greenhouse gases as carbon dioxide. As we know, it's not strictly just carbon dioxide, but what all those other gases have been allocated an emissions factor similar to a gram of carbon dioxide. So the term used is carbon dioxide equivalent. So we don't need to measure each individual gas, just those of carbon dioxide equivalent. Those greenhouse gases have been broken up by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol into 3 different scopes. Scope 1 being direct emissions from your operation, 2 from your electricity supply, and 3 is the much bigger and more complicated indirect emissions. And I'll run through these fairly quickly because it's relatively bland. Scope 1, as I said, is direct emissions. So these are emissions that you as an organisation are directly responsible for. So that would be heating and lighting your offices. If you have fleet vehicles, it would be the emissions associated with the running of those fleet vehicles. Refrigerant loss is part of the Scope 1 emissions that more relevant for maybe your customers, but that refrigerant loss is calculated. As part of our Scope 1 and 2 calculations that Ali mentioned earlier, we do also include just a couple of Scope 3 elements, which is emissions associated with waste and recycling and water consumption, also business mileage. So those that are done not in company-owned vehicles, but for the purpose of running your business. And the reason we include those is because although you may not have direct control over how your water, for example, is processed, you can control the consumption of that water and the supplier that you're with, both of which can reduce the amount of carbon equivalent that is emitted. Scope 2 is an indirect emission. It's how your electricity is generated. It's indirect because you don't necessarily generate unless you have solar or some power purchase agreements on your buildings. You don't control how that electricity is generated. However, you can choose a zero carbon or renewable tariff and therefore reduce the amount of emissions associated with your electricity consumption. And Scope 3, which is the really big and much more complicated area, which is the indirect emissions, upstream and downstream. Upstream, your supply chain. So this would all be your purchased goods, capital goods, transportation. I mean, a few of those on the left-hand column, I mentioned the business travel, waste, we do cover in the Scope 1, 2 calculations, and employee commuting, all the way through to the downstream activities. So that would be distribution of your products, it would be the end-of-life treatment, how they're disposed of, and the use. So how much emissions are going to be, how much carbon is going to be emitted whilst using your products. And I think those sorts of areas are going to be quite crucial for the FEA and their members. The reason Scope 3 is much more complex and more difficult is because the data is not controlled by you, it's controlled by other companies, and therefore it's a slightly more difficult calculation to get accurate data on. So having said all that, what is a net zero organisation and how can you become one? So a lot of these terms have been bandied around without too much accuracy being used. So net zero, carbon neutral, carbon positive, all these terms. So if we just take net zero, it is a term used to define an organisation that has removed as much emissions as possible and offset the residual. Now, it's understood that you're not going to be able to remove all emissions from your operation. There will still be some emissions, but if you've looked at every area and reduced those emissions to the lowest that you possibly can and offset any residual, then you can claim to be net zero. And that's what these net zero targets are aiming towards. The strategy is crucial. Understanding what your carbon emissions currently are is absolutely crucial, and starting that journey. It is just a big jigsaw puzzle, and it's about working out or disseminating your operations and then putting it back together based on carbon emissions. Thank you, Mehak. So I'll hand over now to I think back, is it to Mehak? Are you taking over here or Ali?
Yes. I'll take over
Okay.
from here.
Thank you, Mahak.
Thanks, Crispin. So at this point, I'm sure you all must be wondering, it sounds great to be, to reduce your emissions, to have a strategy in place to get to net zero. But there is a way to get there. And as daunting as that might seem in some cases, it doesn't have to be that way. With a lot of organizations, there's either a lack of resource or skill or time or expertise to take on these strategies and to take on the entire journey on their own. And that's exactly why we're here to help that part out. The way CAFA's process works is that we have a simple 5-step process through which we will take you on this net zero journey. We will begin by collecting your information, calculating your baselines, measuring your emissions through the year, helping you report, and then helping you communicate that with your stakeholders as well. So we begin by allocating you a dedicated carbon buddy who would work to understand the nuances of your organization, what applies to you, what doesn't apply to you, what would really impact your value chain more than, say, someone else's business. This buddy would be someone from the net zero team, so Crispin, Lindsay, or myself. We would help you understand where you need to start from, and we would be there for you throughout the process for any questions that may arise. So with your carbon buddy, we'd begin by collecting data and information regarding your scopes 1 and 2. So we'd identify the right data points and the right data sources that you would need to gather, and we would input that into a really user-friendly dashboard, which you would also have access to for you to be able to see your own emissions as well as for us to calculate your carbon footprint. Once that is calculated, that would be your baseline emissions. And then from there, we would have a strategy planning call where we would determine the best next steps for your business to reduce your carbon as well as costs to be able to meet those timelines. And we have check-in calls with you thereafter to make sure that there are no hindrances on those action plans. Once all of that is on track, we would have, like I said, timely measurement calls for you to ensure and for us to ensure that you're on track with your carbon reduction plan. Throughout the process, you're going to have access to your dashboard, which would allow you to see the progress that you make real time and allow us to enter live data as well. At the end of the year, we would give you reports throughout your journey. So when you start, your baseline report is something you'd receive an action plan, a strategy report, and a progress report. But at the end of the year, you get a final report that states your initial emissions and the progress and that you made through the year, as well as the actions that you've taken throughout the year. This would be an SECR compliant report and would be aligned with GHG protocols and Science-Based Targets Initiative. And this would ensure that you can take business decisions that are sustainable in the future. This can also be supplemented with templates that we would provide you to communicate with different stakeholders that you may have. So your boards, your customers, suppliers, and your value chain, which is increasingly asked for. So we would help you with those as well. Lindsay, over to you.
Thank you, Mahak. So this will just be a quick little demo of our Smart Carbon calculator, which is what we use to actually calculate your emissions once your data has been supplied. So this would be the first entry page that you would enter in on once you actually have access to the dashboard and you've signed up to the community. It would have your demo organization division and then your group of subdivision companies, depending on if you have multiple sites. So we would have to analyze based on site, and then your reporting year, which we can actually see how you have improved year on year and what sites are active and which ones have been completed. So that just covers the general CAFA dashboard once you've entered Smart Carbon. But once you have seen the actual reporting, you can actually enter in to your office and see the total gross intensity, as well as the breakdown of your carbon emissions for scopes 1, 2, and 3. As Crispin has mentioned previously, we use scopes 1 and 2 in our initial reporting, and then we can also go into scopes 3 if we wish. But of course, we've got the parent company and subsidiary company in this particular case here. So it would show that they've released up to about 7,000 kilograms of carbon in that particular annual period. And of course, we can actually see how that is broken down with scopes 1, 2, and 3 here. It's just a simple click of the button. It tells us drop-down menus for which scope we are actually entering. So we can do electricity, we can do travel, we can do your business mileage, we can do anything for scopes 1, 2, and 3, as long as it's within the figures that we have received. It can be populated into this dashboard report, which will actually give us a visual representation at the very end once the actual data has been supplemented and approved. And this will look like this when you actually access the figures. It will be a breakdown of your scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions in a very simple I guess, graph that you can actually hover over and highlight what percentage you are releasing in each scope, as well as your overall emissions, which will be put into a strategy report at the very end of the actual period. Am I covering this, or is Crispin?
Ali, over to you.
Thank you. Sorry, my Wi-Fi just dropped out then for a second. So to summarize what the service consists of, and thanks Lindsay for talking through how the dashboard works. So basically you would be allocated with your own carbon buddy. That's a real person who will work with you to provide hands-on support to gather your data and information across your business. We will enter that into your own emissions tracker, so the carbon calculator that Lindsay's just run through. You'll have oversight of that, and you'll have the opportunity to input data yourself, but strictly speaking, Lindsay and the team would enter that information on your behalf. The FEA also is running their own carbon tracker as well, so their information will sit separately to yours. So it'll be private and confidential information to you unless you wanted to share it with the FEA, and I think that's quite important. The team will assess and create your baseline carbon footprint, including scopes 1 and 2 and some elements of scope 3, which include, Lindsay, remind me, they are some aspects of business travel, waste and water.
Yes.
Great. We will produce a compliant report in line with reduction strategies, which is SCCR. All the report will be based upon greenhouse gas protocols as well, and the science-based target initiative. The team will come up with an action plan to support you and strategies to reduce your carbon footprint, and will work with you throughout each year to measure your progress and be able to provide you with ongoing support and ideas around further reduction. We will also be able to provide you with carbon offsetting options as well. And the team at CAFA will also be able to make really strong suggestions around different ways to reduce your costs, particularly around procurement. We'll provide you access to green suppliers where relevant and appropriate. And ultimately, we'll also help you develop templates in which you can use to report and communicate the progress that you're making to your key stakeholder groups. And that includes your customers, as well as your board and other senior stakeholders, and even the media if you needed PR and public relations templates as well. Thanks, Mehak. So just cover off, I know that Keith already touched on this, but the annual fees are broken down by employee size. So for small employees, we price the service up at a real cost-effective level at £955 plus VAT per year. Medium size, which we categorise as between 1150s to 2250 plus VAT, and large is 4,200. Anything above that or with multi-premises, we would tailor a proposition specifically for you, taking into consideration the style of your organisation and structure of your business, number of employees you have, etc. And as a not-for-profit, all revenue that we generate gets reinvested back into delivering the service. Crispin, over to you.
Thanks, Ali. Right, so this slide just goes into a little bit more detail on Scope 3. I know we looked at the 15 categories, supply chain and value chain. I think Keith mentioned that you are being part of somebody else's supply chain. It means that you are somebody else's Scope 3 emission, which is why you'll be being asked for your carbon calculations and your reduction strategies, because it all ties in with the due diligence that bigger companies, corporates and governments are mandatory have to ask now. So what we can offer with regards to the Scope 3, and I'll just say now that Scope 3 is definitely a bespoke, it's a bespoke service based on so many different reasons. So what we need to do if somebody wants to look at Scope 3 is we'd need to have a good meeting, spend some time understanding what the key areas that you want to look at are, the makeup, the complexity of your operation, your supply chain, your distribution, and then we can put together a plan that can be scaled up or down. It can be looking at just a few areas to start with in year one, and then look to scale into other areas in subsequent years. But essentially what we will offer is a carbon specialist to guide through the Scope 3 areas, identifying the core Scope 3 emissions areas in your operation and those that you might be being asked for, supply chain and value chain modelling. The supply chain modelling, I mean, a lot of companies will have a supply chain based on spend, so they'll know their top 100 suppliers or their top 20% or where the top 50% of spend comes from. And what we try and do is we take that and try and remodel it based on carbon emissions, and then restructure that to look at the priority list with regards to emissions in your supply chain. Some of that data is assumed to start with and then backfilled with real data, just to get the ball rolling and to know where we're all starting from. Emissions factors, reduction areas to focus on, so that remodeling will bring up that priority list. And then measurement and management. So we'll want to be putting in targets, what your emission reduction targets are, and then the strategies that will be employed to achieve those targets. That action plan we do also support as much as we can, with the sort of progress reviews across the year, with at the end of the year a view of what the next year is going to look like. Procurement and supply chain recommendations, and finally carbon offsetting. There's a lot talked about carbon offsetting. We only look and to refer qualified and verified schemes, so that if you are investing in a carbon offset, you know absolutely that it's been approved, as it will mitigate and sequester that carbon from the atmosphere. That's a little bit more about Scope 3. Again, if anybody did want to talk specifically about their operation, then that would welcome a conversation around that. I think this is my last slide. So there is no plan B or planet B. Sorry, that's a little slogan I quite like. The role and opportunity that the FEA have with regards to leading the carbon reduction emissions, being a community of businesses and organisations, it's a really great place to invoke change. We know that there's a lot of emissions associated with equipment, kitchen equipment, commercial equipment, and looking as a whole industry best practice is a really exciting place to be and to be working with. The industry does face the potential for really for a slowing of progress on energy reduction if swift action is not taken. So that's really why we're having these conversations, and to look at best practice within your customers, how your customers can reduce the energy that they are consuming using the equipment that you're manufacturing. So it is a really exciting area to be working in. So Ali, did you want to do the final one?
Yeah, no, thanks, Crispin. I'm not sure if Keith, you wanted to jump in. I know that you're struggling with a bit of a cold today, but basically Climate Action for Associations is offering FEA members the option to, at a very cost-effective price, to start to understand its scope 1 and 2 and part of scope 3 emissions. So when your customers do approach you for your carbon reports, you're ready and able to deliver them. So there should be limited hold-ups to your procurement processes moving forward. Obviously, we're here to help, and we hope that this has been informative. Tracy, I've seen a question from you that I know Lindsay replied to, but I thought it would be worth us just touching on that, in that your question was, I'm interested in understanding the resource required to manage the data requirement and input. As Lindsay said, you'll be appointed a carbon buddy, which is a person who will meet with you, have a discovery call and get under the skin of your organisation. And from there, they'll start to collect the data with you or on your behalf, and apply this information into our carbon calculator and the dashboard. Lindsay, I'm not sure if you wanted to add more into the actual process of the buddy and the hand-holding.
Sure. So essentially, once we are assigned to you as your carbon buddy, that process is fairly straightforward. Crispin has mentioned all of the scope analysis that we do, but essentially you will be given a guide that will tell you exactly what would be required of you. We would need about 12 months worth of information from you, and then that information, once it's acquired, we can put it into the calculator and give you a report with a very quick turnaround, and then do that actual report strategy meeting. Hopefully that answers your question, Tracy.
That's great.
Yeah, just to add in quickly, while we would have to collect a year's worth of data from different sources, it's not going to be some sources that are crazy hard to get. It's going to be as simple as your financial bills for the year, or the amount you've used, or the number of, say, taxis or, say, flights you've taken. So it's not going to be a lot of workload. And if there is something that is relatively difficult, we'd be here to help you through that.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And I think the exercise that Lindsay and the team have just gone through with the FEA as well to calculate its carbon footprint and gather that information took a few weeks to do. And our bodies are there to do all the hard yards on your behalf. So that's a wrap from us. So I'm here to say, what are you waiting for? As organizations, it's really important, but it also is a huge opportunity for you and your industry to start to get a a sense individually and collectively as well around your carbon footprint, as it does open up a huge amount of opportunities for you as a business, as well as obviously providing the picture that your customers and your supply chain are going to be requiring of you in the very near future. Keith, I'm not sure if you're still there, if you wanted to wrap things up, or should we go to further questions?
Well, thank you to the CAFA team for giving us a very clear outline of the need for action, as well as I really like that 5-step simple process of how to take action. And I really like the term carbon buddy. Everybody needs a buddy, but now we need a carbon buddy as well. That's great, great term. My question is related to the carbon buddy on your side. What is a typical person on a company side, on the organization side, that you would need to be paired with? Would that have to be the MD, or would it be a financial director, or perhaps it's several people? What do you typically see?
Can I answer that one, actually? It's a really, really good question. We never recommend the managing director or CEO is assigned to us. They're generally too busy and they get pulled from pillar to post, but somebody that reports into that level is sort of who we're looking for. So companies that are structured in so many different ways with various different job titles, but a lot of the information is held within the financial accounts. So it's usually somebody around that sort of, in that sort of capacity, but it can be anybody. You know, we've had marketing directors, you know, that are pioneering this. It's somebody that needs to have a passion, reportable to the board, but preferably not a board member. So that, yeah, I think that's how I'd answer that question.
Great, thank you, Crispin. Are there any other questions from the FEA members who would like to perhaps unmute yourself and just ask the question?
Yeah, so just hi everyone, it's Tracy again. Obviously top of mind, you can gather from my question that I'm concerned about available resource to get, you know, if we were to engage with the project, how would we get it up and running? So it would typically, you know, how many sort of person hours would it take to kind of gather the data and input that?
Oh, I mean, it very much depends how your data is stored and structured. We've had a full set of data within half an hour from some people, and others it can take much longer. As Lindsay said, we do try and make it as easy as possible, because we know that time is such a crucial factor for any businesses. But so we try and avoid that being a barrier. With the discovery call, and we can have a meeting before that. We can go into a bit more detail as to what the data required is, and how we receive it, because we do receive it, as Lindsay will probably be nodding as I say this, in very different formats from different companies. But because we know what we're looking for, we can pull it out and make sense of it, and then put it into the format that is required. So we'll definitely work with you on that and try to keep the time on your side, the time commitment on your side, as low as possible.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tracy. Any further questions? Well, I think because your presentation was so clear, everybody's covered, questions are covered. Thank you again. Thanks again to the CAFA team for your time today. And this recording will be available on the FEA page, the FEA YouTube page, so that you can view this at a later time. Thank you again, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Thanks all.
Thank you.